Welcome back. It is going to be a juicy one. We're going to continue building on the app that we've done in the last 3 episodes. If you haven't checked out episode 3 where we created a GraphQL service with AWS AppSync in under 9 minutes, go back and do that one, please. We're going to now hook our front end into our GraphQL service. We're going to set up a Reason Apollo hooks. We're going to use the Belt library, the Bucklescript Belt library, to handle the Option Json response that comes back from the GraphQL service, and a few other little bits and pieces. Hope you enjoy it. Let's get stuck into it. So as you can see, we've made a few enhancements to our app since last time using the techniques that we talked about during our second video, styling some pages, creating some layout components, using bs-css alongside Bulma. We've made this nice hero component. We've added some cards where our blog posts will appear and it's nice and responsive. Our routes are still there as per the first video, I think it was. If you haven't watched those, again, please go back and do so, because it's going to help you continue along from here. So now what we want to do is we want to actually hook this into our GraphQL server, our AWS AppSync GraphQL service that we spun up during the third video. And here are the actual components that we created in our project, which is now up to project number 4 in the GitHub, which I'll link below. So as you can see, I've actually renamed the page folder to layout. I think it's just a better description for it. I've added a post component where the blog posts are going to appear, some tags that are going to be within the post. In the layout, we've added the hero, which you saw a moment ago. So a few bits and pieces. So we're going to add to this. I'm not going to go through all of that again. It's really just using the techniques that we went through in the second video. Again, go over that if you want to follow along and then try and recreate this yourself. But I will link the GitHub below. Oh yes, and I've also added posts, which is where we'll render a list of posts that we're going to retrieve, we're going to query from the GraphQL service. Now, at the end of the last video, I showed you how to use a mutation in that GraphQL service in the sandbox. So I've gone and actually created some posts in that GraphQL service. In a later video, we'll create a form. We'll enable an author to actually write up and publish a post. But for now, I've just gone and ran some mutations in the AWS AppSync sandbox and created some mutations there. So yeah, this is what the app is currently looking like, and these are just some dummy posts that we've hard-coded in there for the time being. Now, in order to connect our app to our GraphQL service, the first thing we need to do is set up the Apollo library. Now, one of the great things about Next.js is the extensive library of examples and the very comprehensive documentation. So if you're not sure about how to do something, chances are there is an example project in the Next.js GitHub project. And we're looking for how to set up Apollo with Next.js for the very first time. The very first thing I did was went to the examples directory and found an example there. So I've essentially grabbed some of the information from that with a few modifications to make it work with AppSync. So the first file we've created here is this with Apollo file. I've added a util folder. I've added this with Apollo.js file. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail because I think that's a whole video in itself. But essentially, what this is doing, it's creating the Apollo client, passing in some config information, including our GraphQL endpoint and authentication type and API key, and it's essentially provisioning the Apollo client and returning a higher order component, which we're then going to wrap our app in. But before you do that, you will need to install a bunch of libraries, either npm install or yarn add, whatever floats your boat. You'll need to install the Apollo libraries, so React Common, React Hooks, React SSR, listing those here, setting them out in the description below as well. You'll also need to yarn add a whole bunch of AWS Amplify libraries and Reason Apollo. Now, as at the time of this video, there is an issue with hooking up AWS and the Apollo client, and the AWS guys have put out a couple of patch libraries. So we're importing those now As I'm keeping my eye on that issue thread, as soon as that gets updated, I will update things in the GitHub. But for now, we're using these two libraries, AWS AppSync Auth Link and AWS AppSync Subscription Link. So again, you'll need to install all of those before we then jump over to our _app file. As I mentioned a moment ago, we want to wrap our application in the Apollo provider. Okay, so we're going to then import the Apollo provider, and we're going to wrap our application in the Apollo provider. And we're also adding this, so we're pulling the Apollo client from props that was actually set up in the with Apollo file that we just saw a moment ago. We're going to pass that Apollo client into the Apollo provider. And finally, we're just going to wrap the app in with Apollo, our higher order component. And that's pretty much it for the _app.js page. So I guess we should just go back and quickly check that nothing is busted, and no, our app is still looking good. Everything's working fine. So now we can continue on. The next thing we need to do, and we probably should have installed this at the same time, but we need to add GraphQL Ppx. What this does is it tells our Reason Apollo client about our GraphQL schema, and the Reason compiler is then going to have some validations for us when we're trying to create queries. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to yarn add dev GraphQL _ppx. Once that's been added, we need to add a few things to our bs-config as well. So open up bs-config.json. So we need to add a couple of dependencies. We need to tell Bucklescript about Reason Apollo, which is one of the packages I asked you to install earlier, and Reason Apollo hooks. Oops. And here under ppx flags, this is where we'll specify GraphQL Ppx /ppx. Now, when you run amplify and add an API like we did in our last episode, and we run amplify push to create our environment in the cloud, amplify will actually give us a graphql.json file. And it's essentially a JSON representation of our GraphQL schema. So what GraphQL Ppx looks for, it looks for a file in the home directory called GraphQL _schema.json. So we need to copy our schema.json from source GraphQL that AWS Amplify put there for us, copy that into our home directory, and rename that. Rename that to GraphQL _schema.json, and now Ppx knows about it. So this file is now going to accept a bunch of parameters, which is the data that's going to come back from our GraphQL service. And then we're just going to render those within the body of the component at certain places. So let's add those now. I'm going to add some date styles, just decrease the font to 10. Again, we covered that in video 2 with bs-css. Actually, I'm going to add a tags component because I want to render an array of tags that come back from the service. So let's create that. So you can see this receives arguments in the form of an array of strings, and it returns an array of the tag Reason React component that we've already defined. And now let's render that in our post component. Let's just pop that down here. Let's add our title and clean this up a little bit. I don't think I need these media wrappers. These were actually taken from the Bulma documentation. Very nifty library. If you need a component, you can find something there. So this now looks ready to render all the data that is received from our GraphQL service. Okay, so what I like to do is before I construct a query within the code, I like to create it within the sandbox and just run it just to make sure I've got the query correct. I've got all the information and data coming back that I want. So let's do that now. But before we do that, I want to just quickly show you one more mutation to create a post. So this is, I've already created a bunch, but I'll do one more. So create post, I'm giving it a title, a body, some good old lorem ipsum, some tags, and the author ID. Run that. It will return the post that's been created for us. And now if we run a query to say list the posts that we've created, we should get a list of all the posts. So that query is exactly what I want. So let's grab that and we'll put that in our posts.reason file. Okay, so back to our posts file where we're going to define a new module that's going to consist of our GraphQL query that we just tried out in the sandbox. Next, we need to tell Reason Apollo hooks about this, that this query exists. So we'll create another module. We'll call that list post query. And we'll pass it to the make function of Reason Apollo hooks query. So now inside our React component, we can actually use the query. So Apollo hooks use query will return either a tuple of the variant or the full record, and we're just going to use the variant, which is the simple value there inside the tuple that gets returned. This post query.use. Now this is where things get really juicy, and bear with me here. So it's not that complicated. It's going to seem complicated, but bear with me. Once you've done this a few times, it'll become second nature. So what's going to happen when we run that query? Well, Apollo is going to return either 3 possible states, and one of those states will be a loading state or an error state or the actual data that we want. The data that gets returned is going to be an option. There might be some data or there might be no data. We need to handle that. The common way of handling that inside ReasonML is with a switch statement. Okay, so what happens here is that Apollo, or that use query, is going to return 3 possible states for us. So we're going to create a switch statement to handle those. So one state could be loading. Another possible state could be an error. Or could be another possible state could be there's no data. Or there could be an error. Sad reacts only. Or, if all goes well, we should actually get back the data that we wanted. Now, what is actually returned here is an option. And the normal way that we would deal with an option is to do a switch statement and check whether there is a value or not there. So we don't want to end up in a situation where we've got a whole bunch of nested switch statements, especially in this case where you see our query is list post and under that there's items. There's also going to be an author. So if you have a deeply nested GraphQL query, you could end up with quite a few switch statements and it could end up getting quite messy. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the Belt library. So the Belt library is a standard library that ships with Bucklescript. And we're going to use specifically the Belt.Option module, which is quite handy at helping us handle these options in a cleaner way than having a bunch of switch statements. So let's do that now. So first thing, we're going to call Belt.Option. And I'm going to do this dot open parenthesis, which then sort of opens up that library. I don't have to keep on typing Belt.Option. And we're going to take our response. And inside that, we want list posts. That double hash is how we access children inside a JavaScript object. And then on to the option.flatMap. And from there, we want list posts, the items. So all that flatMap is doing here is taking the value of the option in list posts, passing it into this function here. And all that function does is returns the items, which also happens to be an option, or an array of options, I should say. And now we can pipe that response into the map with default method. The default will either be a React. If there's nothing there, it'll be React.null. But if it is there, then we take the items and we pass them into a function. So those items are an array of options. And if there's something in those options, then they'll give us an array of JavaScript objects. Now to loop through those, we pass them to the Belt.Array.map method. And then for each item, we do a map with default for each of those as well. So stick with me here. And the default will be a React.null. But if there is something there, then we do something with the item. And in this case, we just want to return the post. And then finally we pipe that into React.Array. And let's see what that's looking like. And ba-bow. What's the problem here? Okay, I've seen this before. Okay, so this is why we install Next.js. We need to transpile, I think it's, looks like, yep, Reason Apollo hooks from ES6. So let's add that here. Apollo hooks. This is in our next.js.config. Because we've edited that, we need to restart manually. We can't just rely on hot reloading. Restart the app. Fingers crossed. Second time lucky. Moment of truth. Flip over. Okay. And so there are our components with live data that are rendering. Nice and responsive. Now, if we notice one thing here, we've got an invalid date reference. So let's fix that up right now. The reason why we're getting that is because the created at date that comes back from apps in GraphQL is an option, and it's an option which, if there's a value in it, returns a JSON object. So we need to handle that, and we need to pass that. We need to decode it from JSON into a string. So what I'm going to do is actually create a pass date method up here. You could probably put this in a separate util module, but for now, I'm just going to pop it here. Okay, so we're going to pop a method up here, and we'll call that pass date. That method is going to receive an argument, which we'll call created at. That argument will be an option, which, if it has a value in it, will be a JSON object. And that method will return a string. Now we're going to use the handy Belt.Option module once again. And within that, we'll call the getWithDefault method, where the default will be, well, let's get the actual value from created at. The default will just be a empty null JSON object. We will pipe the response. So once we've got our JSON value, pipe the response. We want to decode it into a string. And finally, once again, get with default. Either give us the value, or if the decode string comes back with nothing, then just an empty string. Okay. And now we can pass the date by passing it into that method. Passed created at equal pass date. We might have to put some curly brackets here. And finally, we can pass the passed date into our post component. If all has gone according to plan, then we should see the date rendered on our page. And yes, there's the date rendered nice and clean. Everything still works by the looks of things. The site's nice and responsive. Great success. So there it is. I hope you found that useful. If you did, please share it around. Give it a comment and thumbs up. Let me know if there's anything else you want me to cover. You know, someone asked me the other day, why don't I put this on one of those sites where I can charge for it? And I'm like, nah, man, I just want to spread the love. So if you guys could share it around and help me spread the love, it'd be much appreciated. We're going to keep on building on the application with some more AWS Amplify stuff. We're going to keep on with ReasonML and Reason React. So please subscribe as well if you want to be notified when the next videos. I'm aiming to do one per week. It doesn't always work out that way, but we'll see how we go. So thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.